A dark army is on the march, destroying everything in their path. An eternal empress uses ancient power to bend reality to her will. The great cities are destroyed by an earth-shattering cataclysm. But all these events have yet to pass, and there may be time still to prevent them from ever happening at all. Cris Tales is an RPG where you play as a young girl named Cris Bell, who is on a quest to stop an evil empress from taking over the world and destroying her town. At the start of the game, Cris Bell is living a quiet life in an orphanage when she suddenly receives a vision of future events. In this glimpse of the future, she sees an army of monsters ransacking her hometown. In order to prevent these events from coming to pass, she teams up with a young wizard, a talking frog, and retrieves a magical sword that will allow her to control time. From there, the game follows a fairly familiar RPG formula. Cris Bell travels around the world, visiting various different islands and towns, meeting NPCs, and recruiting the occasional ally. In each new location, she collects information, trying to track down the Time Empress and put a stop to her plans, although she can also take on various other missions and side quests. As you explore, you'll need to make your way through forests, mountains, and the occasional dungeon. As you do, you'll often fight random battles against various monsters in turn-based combat. During a fight, your characters have the ability to use basic attacks, magical attacks, and items. There are also quick-time events, where pressing the action button right as an attack lands will allow you to either increase the damage that you deal or reduce the damage that an enemy deals to you. Defeating opponents rewards you with money and experience. Experience will allow your characters to level up and learn new skills, while money can be spent in town to buy consumables or upgrade your weapons. Now, most of this sounds pretty familiar if you've played any other RPGs before, with the exception of Cris Bell herself. Early on, it is revealed that she is a time wizard, and this is how she's able to access her premonitions of the future. But where things get interesting is that the developers decided to take this idea of Cris Bell being able to manipulate time and apply it not just to the game's narrative, but also to its mechanics and even to its aesthetics as well. The most obvious effect of this is the unusual triptych display that you see whenever Cris Bell is walking around town. Essentially, the center of the screen is the current time period where your character is, and then to the right you'll see the future, and then to the left you see the past. And it is, what I think at least, is a fascinating visual representation of Cris Bell's ability to see into other time periods. And it's not just a visual feature. You'll actually be called upon to use this power in order to solve quests and complete puzzles over the course of the game. At certain points in the game, Cris Bell will be able to send her talking frog companion into the past or future in order to collect items or talk with NPCs that are otherwise unavailable. You can even use these powers during exploration, fixing a broken bridge by moving it to the past, or destroying an obstacle by moving it into the future. Where things get really crazy is that Cris Bell's powers can also be used during combat. On her turn, Cris Bell can use her energy to shunt enemies that are on one side of the battlefield into the future and enemies that are on the other side of the battlefield into the past. And this isn't just a cosmetic change either. Moving enemies into a different time period changes their attack pattern and their abilities. You can even perform combos with these abilities, using status effects or special attacks to deal more damage to time-shifted opponents. So what's the positive and negative of Cris Tales? Well, for starters, the pacing is pretty good. The game is fairly linear, but each area that you visit has a good mixture of exploration, combat, and narrative. The time travel mechanics are also pretty novel as well. The triptych display is very inventive, and being able to see both the past and future of a location offers you a lot of insight into an area that in most other games would be 100% exposition. And being able to jump back and forth through time leads to a lot of interesting puzzle-solving opportunities. But probably the standout feature is the game's visual aesthetic. I mean, there's nothing about the look of this game that I don't love. Colorful characters, striking visual designs, just beautifully rendered backgrounds that look like they were pulled directly out of an animated movie. And speaking of animation, the game includes a number of stunningly high-quality cutscenes as well. This is one of those games that's not only gorgeous to look at, but immediately distinguishes itself amongst its contemporaries. Now, as for downsides, as mentioned before, I have no problem with the presentation of the game. However, the narrative is a little convoluted. For starters, you're already dealing with the premise of time travel, so at certain points you kind of just have to accept when the characters say, oh yeah, a wizard did it. And even the rules for how time travel works in this reality don't get explained until much later in the game. But the bigger and more frustrating complaint I have about Cris Tales is that its combat system winds up being so painfully generic. Again, as mentioned before, at the start of the game, Crisbel learns that she has the power to manipulate time, and the way that the game implements this in combat is by allowing her to push sections of the battlefield either forward or backward in time. And early on, this has really interesting implications. If you shunt an enemy into the past, they become a younger version of themselves, typically with weaker attack power. By the same token, if you shunt them into the future, they become an older version of themselves, typically with weaker defenses. And as a core ability, this allows you to manipulate the enemies that you face, changing their stats and often changing their attack patterns as well. Then the game starts to implement combo abilities, where if you hit an enemy with a status effect like poison, normally they'll take damage over time. But if you shunt them into the future, they take all of that poison damage at once. Which is nice because it adds some interesting utility to ordinary status effects. Then they start to introduce character combos. One of your party members, for instance, can throw out a time bomb on the battlefield that will explode after a certain number of turns. Unless you shunt that bomb into the future, in which case it explodes immediately and deals damage. Which, again, is a great way of allowing you to manipulate certain effects that would otherwise be high risk, high reward. And after those first few hours, I was really interested to see what kind of new synergies and combinations would unlock over the course of the game. Unfortunately, those new options never materialized. The examples that I've just given represent almost the entirety of your available tactics. Not only do you not unlock new powers or new ways of using them, but you actually lose some of the abilities that I've already described. Status effects become less and less useful as high-level enemies are often immune to them, and your time-shifting powers also see diminishing returns as most in-game enemies and especially bosses can't even be affected by them. Even your character combo options are extremely limited. Only one party member has the time bombs that I mentioned before. Everybody else just has generic magic and melee attacks that I guarantee you've seen before. And the only other party member that has special abilities that can be altered by your time powers doesn't unlock until almost the end of the game. The result is that the combat system, despite its good intentions, winds up being very generic in execution. They introduce this idea that, oh yeah, you're going to be using your time powers to manipulate enemies and alter the battlefield. The first boss in particular cannot be defeated without altering time. And yet, the game gives up on this idea about midway through, and your abilities just stop working. By the end of the game, as far as time powers go, I literally stopped using them, because it was more efficient to just have Cris attack every turn than to even bother trying to manipulate time. So yeah, this is a game that, I love it for its presentation and its ambition. The core combat is at least competent enough to be entertaining, but that foundational idea of being able to use your time powers to get tactical advantages in combat is terribly underutilized and winds up being almost irrelevant by the end. In the end, I would give Cris Tales 3 out of 4 stars, and my recommendation would only be a maybe. This is a game that looks amazing. The aesthetic is like nothing else, but the gameplay itself is very familiar. That, despite the game's elaborate appearance, I would probably only recommend it to casual fans of RPGs. Alright, well, thanks for listening once again. Till the time before, or the time after, perhaps the time in between.